Imagine you are deep in a jungle no map has named. The vines curl toward you, not swaying in a breeze, but reaching. The locals will not enter here. They say the trees are hungry. They say the trees remember the taste of people. Tonight we do not speak of myths. We speak of sworn testimonies of expeditions that went in and never fully came out, of a century-old terror that botanists still cannot entirely explain. Settle in, because this is the story of the legendary cannibal trees and the darkness that made the whole world believe they were real. New dark histories drop every week. Don't let the forest swallow this one before you find it. It was the autumn of 1874, and a man named Carl Lich was writing from a place that most of his readers would never see, and some of them, after reading his letter, would never wish to. He was a German explorer and naturalist, the kind of man who kept meticulous journals, who pressed plants between sheets of parchment, who measured and catalogued and noted everything in the careful hand of someone trained to observe the world without sentiment. He had spent months in the interior of Madagascar, that vast red island off the coast of southern Africa, where the forests were dense as cathedral walls, and the interior still held corners that no European boot had ever pressed into the soft earth. He had gone there for science. He had come back with something else entirely. The letter he sent, addressed to a colleague named Dr. Aumilius Fredlowski of the Société Botanique in Brussels, was later reproduced in the South Australian Register on September 26th of that year. It ran over several columns. The editors, to their credit, printed it in full without editorial comment, as though they themselves were not entirely sure whether they were publishing natural history or nightmare. The letter described many things: the color of the soil in the eastern highlands, the humidity that made his instruments rust and his paper curl, the particular quality of light that fell through the canopy at noon. And then, near the middle of the letter, Carl Lich described what he had witnessed in a clearing 3 days' walk from the nearest village of the Kodos tribe. He described a tree. He called it by no Latin binomial, because he said he knew of no classification that could contain it. It stood, he wrote, between 8 and 10 feet in height. Its trunk was squat and broad, like a pineapple in shape, though dark as charcoal and covered in a surface he compared to rough leather. From its crown extended 8 long leaves, each of them the length of a man's body and rigid as iron, curved slightly downward at the tips, like the fingers of an enormous hand resting palm up in the air. At the center of the crown, where the leaves converged, there was a shallow basin filled with a clear that caught the light and threw it back in prismatic colors. He dipped his finger into this liquid and found it sweet, faintly sweet, the way overripe fruit is sweet, with an edge of something he could not name. He withdrew his finger and wiped it on his jacket, and the jacket, he noted, was slightly stained, as though the fluid was mildly corrosive. Around the top of the trunk just below the leaves, there grew a ring of what he called tentacles, though he acknowledged the word was imprecise. They were pale, translucent, perhaps 6 inches long, and they moved. This was the detail that stopped him. He had been moving through the jungle for months, and he had catalogued creatures and plants of extraordinary variety, but he had never in all of his years in the field seen a plant that moved with apparent purpose. The tentacles swayed in a way he described as sinuous, the word he used in the original German translated later as serpentine, and they were not swaying in a breeze because there was no breeze in that clearing. They moved as though they were waiting. He might have written only that, and the letter might have remained merely a curiosity, a footnote in some later study of ethnobotanical folklore. But Carl Lich did not write only that. He wrote what came next, and what came next is the reason the letter was reprinted across 3 continents, the reason it was translated into 7 languages, the reason men gathered in the reading rooms of private clubs in London and New York and Vienna and read it aloud to each other in hushed voices while the fire burned low. The Kudos, he wrote, revered the tree, not in the distant, abstract way that some peoples honor mountains or rivers, but in a manner that was immediate and participator. They called it by a name he rendered in his phonetic German approximation as something close to Tepi, though he admitted his grasp of their language was incomplete. On the day that Leach arrived at the clearing with his Nkodo guides, there was already a small gathering there. He counted perhaps 15 people, men and women both, standing in a loose semicircle at the edge of the clearing. They were watching. A woman was made to approach the tree. Leach's account here becomes more careful, more precise, as though he was aware that what he was writing would be doubted, and was determined to give the doubters nothing to hold on to. He described how the woman climbed part way up the trunk using footholds he had not previously noticed, carved or worn into the bark. She reached the crown. She drank from the central basin, the sweet, thick liquid that Lich had himself tasted only cautiously. She drank in long swallows, and as she did, her body relaxed. Her arms went loose at her sides. Then Lich used a word he then crossed out and replaced with another, and the replacement word, the one that made it through into print, was trance. She fell into a trance. Then the leaves moved. He wrote this carefully, as a man writes something he himself does not entirely believe, and yet believes he must report. The great rigid leaves, which he had assumed were fixed, had some capacity for slow movement. They were not fast. This was not the sudden snap of a Venus flytrap, which by 1874 was already well documented and somewhat sensationalized in European botanical circles. This was something slower, more deliberate, the way a hand closes around something when the owner is not quite paying attention. The leaves inclined inward. The long, pale tentacles, which had been swaying above, now extended and touched the woman's skin, her arms, her shoulders, the back of her neck, and where they touched, Lich wrote, they adhered. The fluid from the central basin, he understood now, was not merely sweet. It was adhesive in some way he could not at that moment determine. He watched. He did not intervene. This is the detail that his later critics seized upon most aggressively, the detail that the defenders of his account had the greatest difficulty with, not because it was implausible that an observer might freeze in shock, but because Lich's account has, beneath its scientific register, a quality of terrible calm. He observed. He took out his notebook. He wrote down what he saw, and what he saw. He wrote continued for some time, the leaves closing by degrees, the clear liquid welling up and overflowing the sides of the basin. And then at last, when the closing was complete, a dark fluid began to run in thin channels down the exterior of the trunk, and the Kodo people gathered around and drank of it, and they were, Liche wrote, exceedingly joyful. He left the clearing. He returned to his camp. He did not sleep. In the morning he went back, and the tree stood open again. The leaves once more extended, the basin refilling, the tentacles swaying. There was nothing in the clearing to indicate what had happened there, except a faint discoloration at the base of the trunk, and a smell he compared to old copper and rain. What is remarkable about the letter, reading it now at a remove of a century and a half, is not its luridness but its restraint. Lich did not editorialize. He did not offer a moral frame. He did not invoke God or providence. He described the tree with the same careful attention he gave to the soil composition and the light quality and the behavior of the insects around the clearing. He did not claim to have measured the tree's sap or taken a specimen. He admitted his own limitations. He admitted that his grasp of the Kodo language was insufficient to fully understand what the people around him believed about the plant. He admitted that the word trance was his word, not theirs, and might be imprecise. These admissions are the fingerprints of a man who was trying to tell the truth and was sufficiently intelligent to know how much of the truth he was incapable of telling. The letter caused an immediate sensation. Within weeks it had been reproduced in newspapers in Melbourne, London, New York, and Cape Town. Within months, it had been discussed in the Botanical Gazette and in the pages of Popular Science Monthly. A man named Andrew Wilson wrote about it in Illustrated Science News, suggesting that while the scale of the plant was extraordinary, the mechanism described, the adhesive fluid, the sensitive leaves, the slow closure, the sensitive leaves, the slow closure and sensitive leaves, was in principle consistent with known carnivorous plant behaviors, simply extended to an extreme degree. He stopped short of endorsing the account as factual. He did not dismiss it either. Other explorers began to report similar, or plants. A Herr Riedel, whose credentials were never fully established, claimed to have seen a similar species on the banks of the Rio Negro in Brazil. Accounts emerged from Nicaragua, from the Philippines, from various undifferentiated regions of Central Africa. The name Yateveo appeared in one of these accounts, a Spanish phrase meaning "I see you already," and it attached itself to the legend with the tenacity of the very tentacles described in Litchi's letter. The plant had a name now. Names make things real in a particular way. You can dismiss an unnamed rumor. It is harder to dismiss a thing that has been given a name, especially a name as watchful and direct as that one. I see you already. The Kodo tribe themselves became a subject of intense interest. Ethnographers consulted what records existed. The records were thin. Madagascar had a complex and ancient human history, but the interior was poorly documented by anyone outside of it, and the people who lived there had not, for the most part, sought to document themselves for the satisfaction of European natural historians, whether a people called the Mkodo existed at all, and whether they practiced any ritual associated with a carnivorous tree, was a question that could not be answered from Brussels or London or Melbourne. It could only be answered by going there, and the men who said they had gone there were the men who had already given their answers, and their answers were the letters and the testimonies that were now being reprinted across the civilized world. What is true, and what was already understood in 1874, is that carnivorous plants are real. The Venus flytrap had been cultivated in European hothouses since the 18th century. Darwin himself published his landmark work on insectivorous plants in 1875, the year after Litch's letter appeared, a work in which he described in meticulous detail the mechanisms by which sundews and bladderworts and pitcher plants captured and digested their prey. Darwin wrote with unconcealed excitement about these plants. He called the Venus flytrap one of the most wonderful plants in the world. He showed that plants were capable of far more complex behavior than anyone had previously believed, that they could sense, that they could respond, that they could, in their own vegetable way, hunt. This is the soil, precisely, in which a legend like Litchi's could take root and flourish. Darwin had made the carnivorous plant scientifically respectable. The question of whether such a plant could grow larger, could take larger prey, was not, in 1875, obviously absurd. The world was full of unexplored places. The interior of Madagascar was one of them. The Amazon basin was another. The dense interior of Central Africa was another still. The maps of these regions were full of blank spaces, and the blank spaces on maps are the oldest containers for fear and wonder that human beings have ever devised. Carl Litch's account would not be definitively debunked for nearly 3 decades. The botanist W.T. Tithiferdy, the Selton Dyer of Kew Gardens, stated in 1888 that no specimen of any such plant had ever been collected or described in the scientific literature, that no collector operating in Madagascar had encountered it. It encountered it, and that the Mkodo tribe did not appear in any reliable anthropological record. He was not the last to say so. Over time, the consensus hardened. Litchi himself could not be located for interview or follow-up. No second expedition confirmed the clearing. No preserved specimen arrived in any herbarium. The legend went on without the facts, because that is what legends do. They shed their origins like a skin and move forward into the world on nothing but their own momentum, their own plausibility, their own strange and persistent power to make listener, lean forward slightly in the dark and say, quietly, go on. There is a particular quality to the accounts of men who have witnessed something they cannot explain, something that sits outside the edges of their training and their language and their previous experience of what the world is permitted to contain. The quality is not hysteria. Hysteria is loud, is breathless, is full of exclamation marks, and appeals to the reader's sympathy. The quality in Lich's letter is the opposite of that. It is a kind of enforced steadiness, the steadiness of a man gripping the edge of the table, and it manifests as extreme particularity. The tree was between 8 and 10 feet tall. The central basin held a clear liquid. The leaves took approximately this long to complete their motion. These are the details of a man who is very deliberately not thinking about what the details mean, because if he stopped measuring and started feeling, he would not be able to continue writing at all. This is the same quality found in the handful of other first-hand accounts that appeared in the years following Lich's letter. A Polish explorer named Gideon Spilett, writing from Nicaragua in 1881, described a plant he called the devil's snare. Its flowers exuding a fragrance he found overwhelmingly pleasant at first, and then, the longer he stood near it, almost compulsive, as though the fragrance were not merely attracting him but instructing him to remain. He moved away with some effort, he wrote, and looked back to see the petals of the flower slowly furling closed. He did not describe the flower eating anyone, but he described a flower that wanted something from him, and wanting, in a plant, is its own kind of horror. A thing that wants is a thing that can be hungry. A thing that is hungry, when it is large enough, is a thing to be afraid of. In 1887, a journalist and travel writer named C. Has Osborne, later to become the governor of Michigan, visited Madagascar and made inquiries about the tree Lich had described. His findings were ambiguous in exactly the way that the most unsettling findings always are. He found no tree. He found people who had heard of the tree. He found people who spoke of it with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement with which people speak of things they have been told about all their lives and have no reason to doubt, the way you speak of a mountain range in a country you have never visited, knowing it is there because it has always been described to you as being there. The Mkodo, to the extent that Osborne could locate and communicate with anyone who might be identified as Mkodo, neither confirmed nor denied the ritual. They responded to his questions, he wrote, with a courtesy that made it impossible to determine whether their answers were sincere or whether they were simply telling him what they calculated he wished to hear. He came home without a specimen and without a refutation. He came home with the thing that is worse than either, which is a persistent uncertainty, an open question that refuses to close. There is something else worth noting about the legend of the cannibal tree, something that has nothing to do with botany and everything to do with the way human beings relate to the natural world in moments of maximum vulnerability. The 19th century was a period in which the forests of the tropics were being revealed to European eyes for the first time in their full and overwhelming complexity. Darwin had shown that life was a competition, that every organism was in a sense predatory upon every other, that the apparent peace of a meadow or a forest floor was in reality a battleground of slow violence. Against this backdrop, the idea of a tree that ate people was not an aberration. It was a culmination. It was the final, logical step in a direction that science itself had pointed. If everything hunted, then surely, eventually, at the far end of the scale of things, something hunted us. The cannibal tree was the dark mirror of the naturalist's triumph. The discovery turned against the discoverer, the forest finally looking back at the man with the notebook and finding him, too, edible. That is why the legend spread so fast and took hold so deep. Not because people were foolish enough to believe anything, but because they were intelligent enough to recognize, in the shape of that reaching leaf, the outline of a fear they had carried all along. And so, in the tradition of Carl Lich, who sat in his camp in the Malagasy highlands and wrote by lamplight about a thing he claimed to have seen, and who sent his account out into the world knowing that it would be doubted, knowing that the doubt would not matter, knowing that the image he had described, those great curved leaves, that sweet adhesive basin, those pale tentacles reaching for the warm skin of the living, would persist long after any argument about its veracity had run its course. We set the scene tonight in that same clearing, under that same quality of light, with the smell of old copper and rain just barely detectable at the edge of the breath, and we begin. The letter arrived in Brussels on a Tuesday in late October of 1874. Dr. Amelius Fredlowski of the Société Botanique received it among a stack of other correspondence, pressed it open with his thumb, and read it twice before setting it down on his desk and sitting very still for a moment. He was a methodical man. He had spent 30 years in the careful incremental work of botanical classification, the naming and ordering of the vegetable world, and he had learned through long practice to be suspicious of extraordinary claims. He had received, over the course of his career, accounts of plants that cured blindness, and plants that grew only when watered with human blood, and plants that flowered once every 100 years and killed anyone who witnessed the bloom. He had learned to file these things in a particular drawer and leave them there. But Carl Lich was not the usual kind of correspondent. He was known. He had published. His previous letters had been models of scientific restraint, and so, instead of the particular drawer, Fredlowski placed the letter in a different pile, the pile that meant he intended to think about it further. And then he wrote a brief note to a colleague in Leipzig, and then another to a man he knew at the South Australian Register, and then he went home for the evening. And by the time he arrived at his door, the letter had already, in the way that important things sometimes move faster than the people who carry them, begun its journey into the world. The South Australian Register published the account on the 26th of September, 1874, which is the detail that should not be possible. The letter was received in Brussels in late October. The newspaper publication predates that. A chronology has never been fully reconciled, and it is one of the small cracks in the official history of the legend, the kind of crack that, if you press on it too hard, has a tendency to widen into something uncomfortable. What can be said with confidence is that by the end of 1874, the story of Carl Lich and the man-eating tree of Madagascar was in print, and once something is in print, it is no longer merely a story. It becomes a record. It becomes, for all practical purposes, a fact, because most people who read it will never have the means to verify it, and in the absence of verification, print is the next best thing to truth. The South Australian Register was not a small or provincial publication. It reached a readership spread across the continent and beyond. Within weeks, the story had been picked up by newspapers in Melbourne and Sydney. Within months, it had crossed the oceans. The technology of 1874 was not the technology of today, but it was not nothing. The telegraph lines had been running under the Atlantic since 1866. The major wire services, Reuters foremost among them, moved news across continents with a speed that would have seemed miraculous to anyone born before the middle of the century. A story filed in Adelaide on a Monday could, by the following weekend, be sitting on the breakfast table of a reader in London, or New York or Cape Town, slightly condensed and slightly rewritten and carrying, by virtue of that condensation and rewriting, slightly more emphasis on the most dramatic elements than Lich himself had chosen to place there. This is the first mechanism by which fear travels faster than fact. Fact is long. Fact is careful. Fact contains its own qualifications, its own admissions of uncertainty, its own caveats and its own precisely measured hedges. Lich's original letter ran to several dense columns, and was full of sentences that began with phrases like "so far as I could determine," and "it appeared to me that," and "I am unable to say with certainty." Fear has no patience for these constructions. Fear wants the leaves. Fear wants the tentacles. Fear wants the woman in the clearing and the dark fluid running down the bark, and the gathering of the Mkodo people with their cupped hands. Fear is an efficient editor. It knows exactly which paragraphs to cut. By the time the story reached the reading rooms of London's private clubs, it had been reduced to its essential image: a tree, Madagascar, a tribe, a woman consumed. The scientific framing, Litchie's careful notation of the leaf dimensions, his measured uncertainty about the nature of the adhesive fluid, his admission that his command of the local language was incomplete. All of this had been largely lost in the successive reproductions and retelling. What remained was an image, and the image was complete and terrible, and required nothing further to do its work. The London newspapers treated it with the mixture of skepticism and appetite that characterizes the best popular journalism on subjects of this kind. The Times ran a brief item, noting the account and observing that while no confirmation had been forthcoming from any recognized botanical authority, the region in question was insufficiently explored to permit categorical denial. This is a sentence worth reading twice. It is not an endorsement. It is not a refutation. It is the newspaper's way of saying we don't know, but we don't not know, which is precisely the position that a story needs the press to occupy in order to thrive. The Times's conditional non-denial was, in practice, almost as good as confirmation. The story went on. In New York, the coverage was less restrained. Several of the popular magazines that flourished in the 1870s, monthlies and weeklies aimed at a literate middle-class readership hungry for the wonders that the age of exploration continued to produce, published accounts of Litch's letters, with illustrations. The illustrations were extraordinary. They showed the tree in full, lurid detail. Its great leaves curved down like the arms of something reaching, the pale tentacles extended, a figure at its crown shone in a posture that managed to be simultaneously peaceful and horrifying, the posture of someone who has stopped struggling. The illustrators had never been to Madagascar. They had never seen a carnivorous plant larger than a Venus flytrap in a greenhouse. They drew from imagination, which is to say they drew from fear, which is to say they drew exactly what the reader needed to see in order to believe. An illustration does something to a story that words alone cannot accomplish. Words require the reader's imagination to generate images, and the imagination, when left to its own devices, sometimes declines to cooperate, sometimes produces something too pale or too flat to carry real weight. An illustration removes this uncertainty. It shows you the thing. Once you have seen the illustration, you cannot read the words the same way again. The illustration retroactively sharpens all the language. The tentacles that Litch described as sinuous now have a specific appearance, this width, this color, this particular quality of reaching. The woman at the crown of the tree now has a face, a posture, a dress. She is no longer abstract. She is present. She was there, in that clearing, in 1874. And here is the proof. The proof was invented by an illustrator in a New York studio who had perhaps visited the botanical garden in the Bronx and seen, in its collection of tropical exotica, a pitcher plant or a sundew, and who had taken that image and scaled it up in his mind until it was large enough to swallow a person, and then had drawn it from that interior vision. But the reading public did not know this. The reading public saw the illustration and felt what you feel when you see evidence. They felt confirmed. It was in this climate, this worldwide atmosphere of confirmed and illustrated and wire-serviced fear, that the secondary sightings began to emerge. The first came from Brazil, from a region of the Amazon basin that no careful naturalist would have been able to locate on a precise map, which was part of its utility as a setting. A letter published in a German scientific periodical in 1876 described a plant on the banks of the Rio Negro, with characteristics similar to those Litch had reported: the central fluid basin, the adhesive tentacles, the responsive leaves. The author read of this letter was a man named Herr Karl Riedel, about whom almost nothing could be verified. His credentials were described, but not confirmable. His affiliation was listed as private researcher, which is the category that accommodates everyone from a serious amateur to a complete fabrication. His account was shorter than Lich's and less specific in its botanical detail, which might indicate either a less observant witness or a less committed inventor. He did not describe the plant consuming anyone. He described only the mechanism, the fluid and the tentacles, and the slow responsiveness of the leaves, and noted that the local people avoided it. The avoidance of local people is a recurring element in these accounts and deserves a moment's attention. In story after story, across 3 continents in 2 decades, the man-eating tree is framed by the behavior of the people who live near it. They avoid it, or they revere it, or they use it in ritual. This framing serves a double narrative function. First, it validates the danger. If the people who have lived alongside this thing for generations give it a wide berth, the implication is clear: they know something. They have learned the hard way. Their avoidance is testimony. Second, and more subtly, it places the knowledge of the plant's danger at one remove from the narrator. The European explorer, whose direct testimony might be questioned, is insulated by the behavior of indigenous people who cannot be interviewed, and whose own account of things has not been sought and will not be given. The local people become, in this construction, a kind of silent corroboration. They are evidence without being witnesses. They confirm without being consulted. Nicaragua appeared in the legend in 1881, in the account of a German naturalist named Hendrik Bronner, who wrote of a plant he called the Devil's Embrace, encountered in the interior rainforest near the Costa Rican border. His description added a new element to the evolving mythology: the scent. The plant, he wrote, produced a fragrance of extraordinary sweetness and power at certain times of day, particularly in the late afternoon when the light was declining, and this fragrance had a perceptible effect on anyone who stood near the plant for more than a few minutes. It produced, he wrote, a state of mild euphoria accompanied by a curious reluctance to move away. He had noticed this effect in himself before he recognized it for what it was and deliberately withdrew. One of his bearers, less attuned to the analytic habit of self-observation, had stood within range of the scent for perhaps 10 minutes, and had afterward reported feeling, in Bronner's translation, from whatever language the exchange had occurred in, as though the forest loved him. This detail, the chemical manipulation of affect, the plant that made you want to stay, spread through the subsequent retellings of the man-eating tree legend with particular speed, because it resolved an objection that the more literal-minded readers had been quietly forming. An adult human being, the objection ran, would simply step away from a plant whose leaves were beginning to close around them. The slowness of the mechanism that Leach described was, if anything, its most implausible feature. Even the most relaxed and incautious person would notice, in time to escape, that they were being gradually enclosed by large botanical fronds. But a person who had been rendered chemically euphoric and physically reluctant to leave, a person who had been, in the most precise and terrible sense of the phrase, seduced by the plant, that person might not step away. That person might stand exactly still, feeling loved, while the leaves completed their work. The story was improving. Good health. This is what stories do when they move through a population. They adapt, they fill their own gaps, they answer the objections that readers raise, not through deliberate revision by any single author, but through the natural selection of retellings. The versions that answer objections spread further than the versions that don't, and so over time the story evolves toward a form that is harder to argue with, smoother, more complete, more persuasive. By the mid-1880s, the man-eating tree had a scent as well as tentacles. It had a mechanism of seduction as well as a mechanism of capture. It had, in other words, become a more perfect predator, more perfectly suited to its prey. The botanical establishment watched all of this with the particular discomfort of experts observing the popularization of their field. Darwin's work on insectivorous plants, published in 1875, had been received with both excitement and a certain anxiety. It was wonderful. It was also for readers already primed by the Lich account too. Wonderful too, confirming too much in the shape of a key that fit the lock that the legend had installed in the public imagination. The scientists who understood exactly how a Venus flytrap worked, who could explain the electrical impulse that triggered closure, the digestive enzymes that broke down protein in the captured insect, were in a position to say, with full authority, that nothing in what they understood about plant physiology could support the mechanism Lich described. But they were not, and this is the crucial point, in a position to say that they had comprehensively surveyed every square mile of the Malagasy interior. They were not in a position to say that no plant remained undiscovered that might, in principle, behave this way. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the botanists of the 1870s and 1880s were honest enough to know it and honest enough to say so, and that honesty was the single most powerful engine driving the legend forward. Because what the legend required, above all, was not confirmation. It required only the continued possibility of confirmation. As long as the thing had not been definitively ruled out, it lived. It lived in the blank spaces on the maps, in the interiors of the islands and continents that were still, in those decades, genuinely unknown to the people writing about them. It lived in the reports of expeditions that returned with new species by the hundreds, that demonstrated, year after year, that the world was fuller of strange things than anyone had previously imagined. It lived in the reasonable and well-founded suspicion that the world had not yet finished surprising us, that somewhere in the green interior of things, something was waiting to be found that would rearrange everything we thought we knew. By 1890, accounts had emerged from Central Africa, from the Philippines, from the interior of Borneo. The names changed: the Yativio of the Nicaraguan account, the Tep of the Mkodo, the Devil's Embrace of the Browner letter. These were joined by a dozen other local names from a dozen other contexts, all of them describing, with variations that seemed like regional particularity rather than contradiction, the same essential thing: a tree that waited, a tree with fluid and tentacles and responsive leaves, a tree that, when the conditions were right and the prey was sufficiently close and sufficiently unguarded, closed. The man-eating tree had become, in the space of 15 years, a global legend. Not the legend of any one culture or any one place, but a legend that had spread across the planet the way a disease spreads, jumping from host to host through the medium of print, each new account slightly adapted to its local environment, each new version carrying, the core of the thing intact. The fear was the same in Brisbane and Brussels and Boston. The image was the same: the sweet fluid and the reaching leaves, and the clearing in the forest where something was waiting. What changed was only the geography, the name, the particular quality of the local light. The hunger at the center of the story remained perfectly consistent, because it was not the tree's hunger it was describing, it was ours. Our hunger for the extraordinary, for the confirmation that the world was stranger and more terrible than safety required, for the reminder that somewhere beyond the edge of the map, something looked back at us through the leaves and saw, with whatever passed for eyes in that dark vegetable awareness, something worth reaching for, and the reaching never stopped. The legend outlived every debunking, every expedition that returned without a specimen, every botanist's careful statement that no such plant existed in any collection anywhere in the world. It outlived the 20th century. It lives today in the same form it has always lived, as a story told in the dark to people who are almost, but not quite, entirely sure they do not believe it. There is a final mechanism worth naming, the one that operated beneath all the others and made everything else possible. The man-eating tree was not merely a horror story. It was, for the people who read it in the 1870s and 1880s, a story about the world they lived in, and the world they lived in was one that was, by every measurable standard, expanding. New species were cataloged every year by the thousands. New territories were opened, new peoples were encountered. The natural world was revealing itself to be vastly larger, and stranger than any previous generation had known, and the scientists doing the revealing were for the most part celebrated, not feared. Darwin was a hero. The explorers, who brought back specimens from the Congo and the Amazon and the Malay archipelago, were read eagerly and widely. The age was in love with the new and the strange. Into this love the man-eating tree arrived as a kind of dark valentine, it said. In effect, yes, the world is enormous and full of wonders, but it is also full of things that would like to eat you, and some of those things have not been found yet. And one of them is waiting in a clearing that no map has named, and it is patient, and it is sweet, and it knows, in whatever way a plant knows anything, that you are coming. Fear, it turns out, travels not just faster than fact. It travels on the same road, in the same vehicle, dressed in the same clothes. The only way to tell them apart sometimes is to wait and see what they leave behind. Before we return to the legend, we must first sit with the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is strange enough on its own terms, that the legend does not need much help from it. The truth is that the world already contains plants that eat animals, not metaphorically, not in the loose poetic sense in which we say that the jungle consumes the unwary traveler, or that the seas swallow ships. Literally, biochemically, with digestive enzymes and nitrogen absorption and all the cold, patient machinery of predation, just arranged in cellulose and chlorophyll instead of muscle and bone. The world has always contained these things. We simply took a very long time to believe it. The first European to describe a carnivorous plant with any scientific seriousness was Arthur Dobbs, a colonial governor of North Carolina, who wrote to a colleague in London in 1759 about a plant he had observed in the coastal wetlands of the Carolina Low Country. He called it a kind of catch-fly-sensitive plant. He described how the leaves, hinged at their midribs, snapped shut on insects that landed on them, and how the insects, once trapped, were digested over the course of several days, and how the leaf then reopened, emptied, and reset itself for the next catch. He was not a botanist. He was a colonial administrator, with an eye for the curious, and his description was received in London with the polite skepticism that the metropolis reserves for reports from the periphery. The botanist John Ellis, to whom Dobbs had written, did take it seriously enough to forward a specimen to Carl Linnaeus, the great Swedish classifier who had given the natural world its naming system, and Linnaeus, after examining it, named it Dionea muscipula, the Venus flytrap, which is a name containing, if you think about it too long, its own little myth. The trap of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, which catches you precisely because it is beautiful, and because beauty, in the logic of myth, has always been a mechanism of capture. Linnaeus, for all his genius, did not believe the plant actually digested its prey. He thought the closing of the leaves was a defensive reflex, a protection against insects that might damage the plant's reproductive parts. This is a remarkable failure of imagination from a man who spent his life imagining the organization of the living world, but it is also perhaps a forgivable one. The idea that a plant might deliberately and strategically acquire animal protein for nutritional purposes was so far outside the conceptual framework of what a plant was supposed to be that even the man who had done more than anyone else to define that framework could not quite accommodate it. Plants made their food from sunlight and soil. Animals hunted. These were not categories that overlapped, and no amount of snapping leaves in a Carolina swamp was going to collapse them overnight. It took another 100 years in Charles Darwin to collapse them properly. Rhine's Insectivorous Plants, published in 1875, is one of the strangest and most quietly radical books in the history of science. It is a book about plants that eat, and it proceeds with the same meticulous, accumulative attention that Darwin brought to everything else, the same patient marshalling of evidence, the same willingness to follow observation wherever it led, even when it led somewhere that contradicted everything previously assumed. Darwin had been studying carnivorous plants for more than 10 years before the book appeared. He had grown sundews on his windowsill at Down House and watched them under a magnifying glass for hours. He had fed them roast beef and cheese and bits of hard-boiled egg, and noted, with something that reads in his letters as barely suppressed delight, that they digested all of it. He had performed hundreds of experiments with different substances, testing which ones triggered the glandular hairs to curl inward and secrete their digestive fluid, and which ones did not. He was, by his own account, more interested in sundews at that period than in anything else in the world, including, he wrote to a friend, the origin of all species. The sundew is the plant that rewards this obsessive attention most richly. It is a small plant, found in bogs and fens, and other wet, nutrient-poor environments across most of the temperate world. Its leaves are covered in fine red hairs, each tipped with a glistening droplet of sticky mucilage that catches the light and looks, from the perspective of a small flying insect, exactly like a dewdrop catching the light, which is to say it looks exactly like water. An insect looking for water lands on a sundew leaf and finds that what looked like water is actually glue, and by the time this discovery has been made, the adjacent hairs have begun to bend inward, slowly, over the course of minutes and hours, curling toward the struggling insect in a motion that Darwin described as resembling the closing of a hand, and the digestive enzymes have begun to flow, and the insect, which may still be alive and still be struggling, is being dissolved. It takes between 1 and 3 days depending on the size of the prey. Then the leaf opens again, and the hairs reset, and the dewdrops reform at the tips, and the trap is ready. Darwin called this behavior purposive. He used that word carefully, knowing how much weight it carried, knowing that purposiveness was a quality that had previously been reserved for creatures with brains and nervous systems and the apparatus of conscious intention. He used it anyway, because he could not find a better word for what he observed. The sundew's hairs responded differentially to different stimuli. They responded to the chemical signature of nitrogenous compounds, the chemicals that indicate the presence of protein, the presence of food. They did not respond to rain, or to sand, or to bits of glass. They were, in every functional sense of the word, discriminating. They knew the difference between food and not food, and they acted accordingly, and if that is not purposive, then the word has no meaning. The Venus flytrap takes this purposiveness and makes it sudden and spectacular, which is why it has always been the carnivorous plant that captures the human imagination most thoroughly, the one that appears in the illustrations, the one that children ask for at garden centers, the one that gave its name and basic design to the entire tradition of giant fictional man-eating plants that runs from the late 19th century to the present day. It is dramatic in a way that sundews are not. The sundew is slow, is gradual, is the patient, inevitable kind of killing. The fly trap is fast. It can close in under a second when properly triggered, which means that, for the insect exploring the inside of the open trap, there is a moment of normal existence, and then, with essentially no transition, a moment of total enclosure. The world was open, and then the world was closed, and the closing happened too fast to respond to, too fast to escape. The mechanism of the closure has been studied intensively for 2 centuries, and is still not fully understood. What is known is that the trigger hairs inside the trap, 2 or 3 stiff hairs arranged across each lobe, must be touched twice within a short window of time before the trap closes. A single touch does nothing. This is often described as the plant's way of distinguishing between a live insect, which will move and touch the trigger hairs again, and a dead bit of debris, which will touch once and be still. It is, in other words, a test. The trap tests its potential prey. It requires the prey to demonstrate aliveness before it commits to the capture. This detail, when you sit with it for a moment, has a quality of cold intelligence that is deeply unsettling in a thing that has no brain, no nervous system, no centralized processing of any kind. It is not intelligence, it is chemistry, but it behaves so much like intelligence that the distinction, in the dark, in a clearing somewhere, begins to feel academic. The pitcher plants are the third great family of carnivorous plants, and they are, in terms of the myth of the man-eating tree, the most important. Not because they are the most dramatic in operation, though they have their drama, but because they are the largest carnivorous plants in the world are pitcher plants, specifically the Nepenthes genus, found across the tropical regions of Southeast Asia, from the highlands of Borneo to the rainforests of the Philippines to the cloud forests of Madagascar. Madagascar, again. The Nepenthes pitcher plants grow as vines climbing, signed through the forest canopy, hanging their pitchers from the ends of modified leaves, like enormous ornaments, some of them the size and rough shape of a large jug or a small bucket, filled with a fluid that is partly rainwater and partly the plant's own digestive secretions, a fluid that is slightly acidic, slightly viscous, and deadly to almost anything that falls into it. The pitchers attract their prey with color, with scent, and with nectar secreted along the lip of the opening. An insect following the scent lands on the rim, finds the nectar, moves to the inner edge of the lip for more, finds the nectar, moves to the inner edge of the lip for more, and discovers that the inner surface of the pitcher is coated with a waxy, ultra-smooth substance that provides essentially no purchase for insect feet. There is, for the insect, a moment of confusion, of traction loss, and then a fall, a very short fall, into the fluid below, and then the slow chemistry of digestion. Some of the larger Nepenthes species, particularly Nepenthes raja and Nepenthes lowii of Borneo, have pitchers large enough to drown and digest not just insects but small frogs, lizards, and rodents. This has been documented. This has been photographed. A mouse fully grown has been recovered from the interior of a Nepenthes raja pitcher in an advanced state of digestion. The plant ate the mouse. The plant ate the mouse, and the plant is still there, in the highlands of Borneo, hanging its pitchers in the forest air, waiting. The question that the Nepenthes genus forces onto the table is simply one of scale. If the mechanism works at the size of a mouse, what is the principled reason it could not work at the size of something larger? The answer that botanists give is a good one. It involves the physics of fluid dynamics in larger containers, the ratio of digestive enzyme concentration to prey volume, the structural limitations of plant tissue under load, the absence of any evolutionary pathway that would select for prey of the size in question. It is a complete and satisfying answer to anyone who understands plant physiology. It is considerably less satisfying to someone standing in the Borneo highlands at dusk, watching a pitcher the size of a large cooking pot swing gently in the forest air, knowing that there is a dissolved mouse somewhere near the bottom of it. The answer works on paper. In the forest, at dusk, with the pitcher swinging, the answer requires a little more effort to hold on to. This gap between the answer on paper and the feeling in the forest is where the legend of the man-eating tree has always lived. And it is a gap that the discovery and documentation of real carnivorous plants did not close. It widened it, because the discovery of real carnivorous plants did not say to the public, "Here's the limit of what plants can do." It said, "Here's what plants can do, and we were wrong about them before, and we may be wrong about them again." Every time a new species of Nepenthes was described in the Victorian botanical journals, every time a collector in Borneo sent home a specimen that exceeded in size any previously recorded pitcher plant, the implicit argument for the man-eating tree gained a small increment of plausibility. Not through logic, through feeling, through the accumulated feeling that the natural world was larger and stranger and more predatory than anyone had previously been willing to admit, and that the boundary between what was known to exist and what was known not to exist had been wrong before, and might be wrong again. Darwin understood this dynamic though he never commented on the man-eating tree directly. But in the opening pages of Insectivorous Plants, he noted that the idea of a plant feeding on animal matter had been greeted with incredulity by the scientific establishment just 50 years earlier, that Ellis himself, when he had first proposed the carnivorous nature of the Venus flytrap to the Royal Society, had been met with polite skepticism of the most immovable kind. And Darwin wrote that the history of the carnivorous plants should be a reminder to anyone tempted toward certainty about the limits of the natural world, that nature had a long record of exceeding those limits in directions that observation had not anticipated. He was writing about sundews. He was writing about bladderworts and butterworts and the various adaptations by which nitrogen-poor environments had produced plants capable of supplementing their nutrition with animal protein. But the reader of 1875, already in possession of Lich's letter, already carrying the image of the Madagascar tree in their mind, could be forgiven for reading a slightly wider implication into those words. The world, Darwin had shown, was full of plants that ate. The world, Liche had claimed, contained at least one plant that ate people. Between those two propositions, the distance was large, but it was no longer infinite. That is what the science did for the legend, and that is what the legend did for the fear. It made the distance measurable. It gave the fear a scale, a set of real coordinates to anchor itself to, a foundation of verified and documented and illustrated truth from which the larger, darker claim could be reached by extension. You did not have to believe in the man-eating tree to be afraid of it. You only had to believe in the sundew and the nepenthes and the Venus flytrap, and then let your imagination do the arithmetic. Let it multiply the known by the unknown, and arrive, in the green and dripping silence of wherever you were sitting when you read this, at the answer that the legend had been waiting all along for you to reach. There is one more plant that deserves its place in this is accounting, less famous than the others, less often found on the windowsills of curious children, but more relevant than any of them to the architecture of the man-eating tree legend. It is called the bladderwort genus Utricularia, and it is found on every continent except Antarctica, in the shallow water of ponds and bogs, and slow rivers, and the wet mossy surfaces of tropical trees. It is small and unremarkable in appearance, a tangle of fine stems and tiny yellow or purple flowers, the kind of plant that most people walk past without a second glance. But beneath the water, or beneath the wet moss, the bladderwort operates the most mechanically sophisticated trap in the plant kingdom. Each bladder, and a single plant may carry hundreds of them, is a small hollow vessel, roughly the size and shape of a raindrop, from which the interior has been actively pumped free of water, creating a partial vacuum inside. The entrance to the bladder is sealed by a trap door with a hair trigger mechanism, and when a small creature, a water flea, a mosquito larva, a tiny aquatic worm, brushes against the trigger hairs, the trap door springs open. The vacuum sucks the creature inward in a fraction of a millisecond, and the door snaps shut again. The whole operation takes roughly a 10,000th of a second. It is the fastest movement in the plant kingdom. It may be the fastest trap in nature, period. The plant then digests its prey and resets the vacuum, pumping out the water again, waiting, a 10,000th of a second. That is how long the bladderwort's prey has to react, which is to say, no time at all. There is no world in which the prey responds to that trap. There is no world in which the water flea feels the trapdoor beginning to open and makes a decision to swim away. The trap is faster than decision, faster than reflex, faster than the nervous system of anything small enough to be caught by it. It is not a trap that its prey can learn to avoid. It is a trap that its prey simply falls into, every time without recourse. And the bladderwort sits in its pond or its wet moss, small and flowering, and entirely unimpressive to look at, running this perfect, merciless operation indefinitely. Trap after trap after trap in the absolute silence of a world too small, and too fast for us to observe without instruments. When you hold the bladderwort in mind alongside the sundew and the Venus flytrap, and the Nepenthes pitcher, a pattern begins to emerge. Each plant has evolved its carnivory independently, in its own lineage, as a response to the same environmental problem. Nitrogen-poor soil or water, where the usual route of absorbing nutrients from the ground is insufficient to support growth and reproduction. Carnivory is, in botanical terms, a workaround. It is what happens when the ground cannot provide what the plant needs, and the air above the ground is full of small things carrying the needed nutrients in their bodies. The plant, over millions of years, finds a way to intercept those small things. It evolves glue, or it evolves a hinge, or it evolves a pitcher, or it evolves a vacuum trap, depending on what the available materials and the local prey population make most efficient. It does not plan this, it does not decide, but the result in every case is a mechanism of capture and digestion that is, in its own domain, perfectly suited to its purpose. This is what makes carnivorous plants so philosophically disorienting and so permanently useful to the legend of the man-eating tree. They demonstrate that predation is not a strategy that belongs to the animal kingdom. It is a strategy that belongs to life itself, to any living system operating in an environment where nutrients are scarce and alternative sources of nutrition are available. If the conditions are right, life finds a way to eat what is nearby. That is what the carnivorous plants prove, across their hundreds of independently evolved species on 6 continents. Given the right conditions, a plant will eat. Given the right conditions, anything will eat. The question is only what is nearby, and how large the trap needs to be, and how patient the hunger is. In a nitrogen-poor jungle in Madagascar, with large, slow-moving animals moving through the undergrowth, what would the right conditions look like? What would they produce given sufficient time and sufficient pressure? The botanists have their answer. It is a good answer, and it is probably correct, but it lives, still, in uneasy proximity to the alternative, to the image of something the size of a man standing in a clearing and feeling too late. The first slow closing of leaves that are larger and stronger and older than anything it has ever had. Cause to be afraid of before. To understand why people believed in the man-eating tree, you have to first understand something about the century that produced the belief and about the particular quality of mind that the 19th century cultivated in its educated classes, and about the specific shape of the ignorance that that mind carried around with it everywhere it went, mistaking the shape for knowledge, mistaking the container for the thing inside. The 19th century was, by any measure, the most scientifically productive century in human history up to that point. It produced the theory of evolution and the germ theory of disease, and the periodic table and the laws of thermodynamics and the electromagnetic field and the cell theory of life. It produced more ordered, verified, published knowledge about the natural world in 100 years than the previous 2,000 years combined had managed. And yet, in the midst of all this knowledge, something else was also being produced, something that the knowledge paradoxically fed and enlarged rather than diminished. It was producing, at the same time, and in the same minds, an enormous and systematic and carefully maintained ignorance about the majority of the human world. The word for this ignorance, applied to the specifically geographic version of it, was terra incognita, unknown land. The maps of the Victorian era are instructive in this regard. Pick up any atlas published between 1840 and 1890 and turn to the page showing the interior of Africa. You will find coastlines drawn with precision, major rivers traced to the point where the information of the coastal traders gave out, and then spreading across the center of the continent, a vast white space, not empty space in the sense of a space where nothing existed. Empty in the sense of a space where the mapmaker had no verified information to record, and so recorded nothing. The white space was not absence. It was acknowledged ignorance, which is a very different thing, and which carries a very different emotional charge. Absence is nothing. Acknowledged ignorance is a question, and questions are things you cannot stop thinking about. Joseph Conrad, writing at the end of this period, described looking at a map of Africa as a boy and feeling a particular fascination with the blank center. He wrote that the blank spaces on maps had always exerted a pull on him, and that by the time he was a grown man, most of them had been filled in, had been turned from invitation into information, and that something had been lost in the filling. He was writing about the Congo, and the darkness he found there was not geographical but moral. But the dynamic he identified is the same one that operated throughout the century. The blank space invites projection, invites the filling of the unknown with whatever the imagination, shaped by its particular cultural moment, is most inclined to produce. What the Victorian imagination was most inclined to produce, when it looked at the blank spaces on the map, was danger. Not random danger, not the neutral hazards of unfamiliar terrain, disease, and weather, though those were real and were acknowledged. Something more specific, more narratively satisfying. The blank spaces on the Victorian map were populated, in the popular imagination, and in much of the official discourse of the period, with savagery, with tribes that practiced cannibalism and human sacrifice and ritual of a kind that the European reader was invited to understand as the inversion of civilization, the dark mirror of everything that the century's progress had achieved. The interior of Africa, the Amazon basin, the highlands of Madagascar, the deep interior of Borneo, these were not merely unknown. They were framed consistently and with enormous cultural authority as the places where the rules of the civilized world did not apply, where nature was read in tooth and claw without even the thin membrane of social organization to contain it, where anything might happen and probably did. This framing was not innocent. It served purposes that had nothing to do with botany or natural history and everything to do with the political organization of the world in that period. The European powers were, throughout the second half of the 19th century, engaged in the active project of colonizing the very regions that the blank spaces on the maps indicated. Africa was being divided among Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Portugal, with a speed and thoroughness that left almost no part of the continent outside European political control by the century's end. The Amazon basin was being penetrated by rubber traders whose methods were so brutal that they would eventually produce one of the first recognized international human rights scandals of the modern era. Madagascar itself was made a French protectorate in 1882 and a full French colony in 1896. The blank spaces, in other words, were being filled not just by knowledge, but by administration, by extraction, by the apparatus of colonial power. And the narrative of the blank space as a place of savagery and danger served this project directly and efficiently because it provided the justification for the filling. If the interior was dark, if it was a place where human sacrifice occurred, and where man-eating trees grew, and where the normal categories of civilized existence did not apply, then bringing it under the governance of European law was not conquest. It was rescue. It was the light entering the darkness. It was, in the language that the century used for this project, and that we have since learned to read more critically, civilization. The man-eating tree was a product of this narrative structure, as much as it was a product of Carl Lich's letter. It arrived at precisely the moment when the European imagination needed it. It confirmed what the blank space narrative had been arguing for decades, that in the unmapped interior of the world, nature was predatory in ways that exceeded anything that temperate observation had prepared you for, and it added a specifically botanical dimension to this predation that was, if anything, more disturbing than the human savagery it sat alongside. Because at least human savagery operated by recognizable, if abhorrent, logic. A tree that ate people was something else. It was nature itself as predator, the environment as enemy, the ground beneath your feet and the air around you as hostile, in a fundamental and inescapable way. You could, in principle, negotiate with a person. You could not negotiate with a tree. The scientists who accepted the legend or who declined to dismiss it were operating inside this same narrative structure. They were not, for the most part, credulous men. They were trained observers with strong methodological standards and a professional commitment to verification. But they were also men of their century, shaped by its assumptions, embedded in its conceptual framework, and the conceptual framework they inhabited said loudly and with enormous institutional backing that the unexplored regions of the world were places where the normal limits of the natural world might not apply. When Leach's letter arrived, these men did not simply evaluate it as a botanical claim. They evaluated it as a botanical claim embedded in a context that they had been prepared by decades of popular and scientific literature about the tropics to regard as a place where extraordinary things were possible. Their skepticism was genuine, but bounded by the assumption that the world beyond the map was genuinely and specifically more dangerous and more strange than the world they lived in, and that this additional strangeness was most concentrated in the bodies and practices of the people who lived there. This brings us to the Mkodo. Carl Lich's account required the Mko not merely as witnesses to the plant's behavior, but as participants in a ritual use of the plant. Without the Mkoda, the man-eating tree is merely a biological curiosity, a dangerous plant to be avoided. With the Mkodo, it becomes something with a social dimension, a human dimension, which makes it simultaneously more believable and more frightening. More believable because human testimony, however filtered through Lich's limited language skills, carries more weight than observation alone. More frightening because the implication is that the plant's predation on human beings was not accidental, not the result of a blundering tourist approaching something dangerous in ignorance, but was deliberate, was managed, was incorporated into the ritual life of the people who lived alongside it. The tree ate because the Kodo fed it, and the Mkodo fed it because they had been doing so for generations, because the plant had become part of the structure of their society, part of the mechanism by which social order was maintained and enforced. Somebody was chosen, was made to climb, was made to drink, and the Mkodo people watched and were exceedingly joyful, which is the phrase that does the most work in the entire account, because it turns the horror from natural to social, from ecological to political. The joy is the worst part, not the tree. The people watching the tree and being glad. This construction is recognizable. It is the construction that the European reading public of 1874 had encountered many times before in accounts of human sacrifice from the Aztec Empire and from various Africa, in ritual contexts, and from the reported practices of numerous other non-European peoples that the century's explorers had described and that the popular press had reproduced with a consistency that amounted to a genre. The genre was the sacrifice narrative, and its elements were fixed. A powerful natural or supernatural force, a human offering, a community of observers who participated in the offering with what was described as joy, or ecstasy, or religious fervor. The man-eating tree fit this template so precisely, matched its elements so exactly, that the reading public did not need to work very hard to absorb it. They already knew this story. They had read it before in other places. Lich was not giving them something new. He was giving them a new specimen of a familiar type, and the familiarity of the type made the new specimen easier to accept. This is the psychology of believing at its deepest level. We believe most easily the things that match the shapes already present in our minds, the templates and patterns and narrative structures that previous experience has laid down. The man-eating tree arrived in the minds of its Victorian readers in a world that already contained carnivorous plants, confirmed by Darwin, and sacrifice rituals, confirmed by 100 travel writers, and blank spaces on maps that were known to be full of the extraordinary, confirmed by every expedition that came back with something previously unknown. It matched every template simultaneously. It was, from a cognitive standpoint, irresistible. But there is one more layer beneath this, one more stratum in the psychology of believing that is perhaps the most fundamental of all, and it has nothing to do with colonialism or botanical science or the blank spaces on Victorian maps. It is older than all of those things. It is the layer that was present in human minds long before there was a word for psychology or a discipline for its study, the layer that was deposited there in the long, slow millennia when human beings were not, as a matter of settled fact, the apex predators of their environment. For most of human evolutionary history, something ate us. Large cats ate us. Crocodiles ate us. Hyenas ate us. The forest was not a place of neutral hazard. It was a place of directed predation, and the directed predation left marks in the human nervous system that are still there, still operational, still producing the same response whenever the mind encounters an environment that matches the template of the old danger, darkness, enclosure, vegetation, the sense of being watched. The man-eating tree activated this layer with surgical precision. It placed a predator in the one environment where the evolved human fear system least expected to find one, because for most of human history, the primary threats in the forest were mobile. They had legs, they could be heard and smelled and tracked, a predator that did not move, that was rooted, that looked like everything else around it, that was indistinguishable from the background, until the moment of capture, was something the fear system had no specific protocol for. It was a predator that broke the rules of predation. And things that break the rules of predation are more frightening than things that follow them, because the fear of a lion includes the knowledge that you can, in principle, run. The fear of a tree includes the knowledge that you cannot, because a tree is everywhere. You cannot run from a tree. You are already standing in a forest of them. This is why the man-eating tree legend has survived every debunking, not because people are credulous, not because the evidence for it has ever been sufficient, but because it reaches down past the part of the mind that evaluates evidence and addresses itself to the part that cannot stop scanning the undergrowth. The part that has been scanning the undergrowth for 2 million years, the part that was scanning it long before there was language to describe what it was looking for. That part of the mind does not require evidence. It requires only the pattern. Something in the green dark that wants you, something that knows you are coming, something that is patient in the way that only a rooted thing can be patient, because it has nowhere to be and nothing to do but wait. It found that pattern in Carlich's letter in 1874, and it has been holding on to it ever since, quietly, in the way that the most persistent fears are held, not in the conscious mind where they can be examined and refuted, but somewhere lower and older, and altogether more certain about what the forest contains. There is a word in German, Waldeinsamkeit, for which there is no precise English equivalent. It describes the feeling of solitude and connection that comes from being alone in a forest, a feeling that is neither entirely comfortable nor entirely frightening, but which partakes of both in a proportion that shifts depending on the quality of the light and the density of the trees and the presence or absence of sound. The Romantics loved this feeling and pursued it deliberately, wrote poems about it, painted it, but underneath the romanticism, underneath the cultivated appreciation for the sublime experience of nature, there is something older and less refined operating. The forest has always been both sanctuary and threat in the human imagination, and the proportion between those two qualities has always been unstable, capable of tipping from one to the other with no more provocation than a change in the light or a moment of silence, where a moment before there was sound. The man-eating tree belongs to the tipping point. It is the moment when the forest which Q had perhaps been appreciating as sublime, reveals that it has been appreciating you in a different register entirely. This is the structure of the deepest kind of horror, not the monster that arrives from outside the safe perimeter, not the monster that arrives from outside the safe perimeter, but the revelation that the safe perimeter was never safe, that the thing you were standing in was looking at you all along. that the green world you have been moving through has an appetite, and you are in it. This is older than any specific cultural narrative. It is older than colonialism, and older than the Victorian natural history tradition, and older than the blank spaces on any map. It is the original fear, the one that preceded language, and that language has never quite managed to contain, only to describe in new terms for each new generation that inherits it. What the 19th century contributed was not the fear but the vocabulary. It gave the fear a specific botanical form, a specific geographic location, a specific colonial context, a specific set of scientific adjacencies that made it feel like something that could in principle be verified. It dressed the old terror in new clothes and gave it a name, Ya te veo, I see you already, which is perhaps the most precise expression ever coined for the feeling of being watched by something that has no eyes. But underneath the new clothes, the old fear is unchanged now as it was unchanged then, is the same fear that caused the hair on the back of the neck to rise in a forest 2 million years ago, and causes it still, in the right forest at the right moment, when the light changes and the sound stops and something in the peripheral vision moves, or seems to move, in a way that is not quite consistent with the wind. The scientists of the 1870s and 1880s who hesitated before dismissing the man-eating tree were not, in the end, being unscientific. They were being honest about the limits of their knowledge in a way that their successors, with more complete maps and more comprehensive surveys, could afford not to be. But they were also, beneath the professional caution, subject to the same ancient prop that every human being who has ever stood in a forest at dusk has felt. The green world is patient. The green world is very old. The green world has seen everything that has walked through it, and has, in ways that we do not fully understand, and may never fully understand, been changed by the seeing. Whether any of that change amounts to something that could be called hunger is a question that the science has answered firmly, and the nervous system has declined to accept. The nervous system, it turns out, has been collecting its own evidence for considerably longer than the science has been asking questions, and it has reached its own conclusions, and it keeps them in a place that no debunking, however thorough and however well evidenced the official position held by the botanical establishment since the late 19th century, and maintained without significant revision to the present day, is that the man-eating tree of Madagascar does not exist. Carl Lich cannot be located in any verifiable record of European naturalists working in the region. The Mkodo tribe does not appear in any reliable anthropological survey of Madagascar's interior populations. No specimen of any plant resembling the one described has ever been collected, pressed, catalogued, or deposited in any herbarium anywhere in the world. The case is closed. The legend is a legend, which is the scientific way of saying that it is a story people told because they needed to tell it, not because it was true. This is the official position, and it is almost certainly correct, and it settles almost nothing, because the history of the official position on extraordinary botanical claim, say as a history that contains, at regular intervals, the spectacle of the official position being wrong. Consider the case of the coelacanth. For 65 million years, the coelacanth was assumed to be extinct. It appeared in the fossil record in abundance, and then disappeared from it. And the reasonable inference, the inference that every paleontologist and marine biologist of the 19th and early 20th century would have endorsed without hesitation, was that it had died with the dinosaurs. In December of 1938, a South African museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer noticed an unusual fish in the day's catch from a trawler working off the mouth of the Chalumna River. It was large, nearly 5 feet long, covered in thick bluish scales, with fins that looked less like a fish's fins and more like the stumpy lobed appendages of something that was deciding, in the most geological of timescales, whether it wanted to be a fish or something else. She did not know what it was. She had it preserved and brought to a scientist. The scientist J.L.B. Smith identified it as a coelac, and scientist J.L. position on what existed in the deep ocean was revised, without ceremony, to accommodate a fish that had been living undiscovered in the Indian Ocean for 65 million years since its supposed extinction. The deep ocean had simply been keeping it to itself. The official position on the giant squid held, for most of the 19th century, that the kraken was a myth. Sailors had been reporting encounters with enormous cephalopods for centuries, had described tentacles the width of a man's arm, and bodies the length of a sailing ship, and the official position had treated these reports with a tolerance extended to the accounts of men who spend long periods at sea and are known to drink. Then, in 1853, a giant squid washed ashore in Denmark. Then another, in Newfoundland in 1877. Then several more, in various states of decomposition, in various parts of the North Atlantic. The giant squid was real. It was very large. It lived in the deep ocean and came to the surface, rarely, and probably died more often than it was found. And the official position was revised again, this time to include a creature with eyes the size of dinner plates that had been existing in the world's oceans. Perfectly real and perfectly enormous. Oceans, perfectly real and perfectly enormous, throughout the entire period during which it had been officially classified as a sailor's exaggeration. These are not ancient stories. The Coelacanth revision happened in 1938. The giant squid revision happened across the second half of the 19th century. The exact period during which the man-eating tree legend was circulating in the popular press. The revisions matter not because they establish that the man-eating tree is real, but because they established the precise shape of the epistemic situation. The ocean is deep, the jungle is dense, the survey is incomplete, and the official position has a documented history of being wrong about what exists in the places that have not been thoroughly examined. This does not prove anything. It only keeps the door from closing all the way. Modern botanical surveys of Madagascar are more comprehensive than they were in Leach's time, but they are not complete. Madagascar is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, and one of the most poorly studied, for the simple reason that its interior is difficult to access. Its political situation has been periodically unstable in ways that make long-term scientific fieldwork difficult, and its forests are disappearing with a speed that means species are being lost faster than they can be catalogued. The current estimate produced by a consortium of conservation organizations working with the Malagasy government is that Madagascar contains somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 species of flowering plant, of which approximately 80% are found nowhere else on Earth. Of these, a significant number remain formally undescribed by science. They have been observed by local people for generations, have been used in traditional medicine and ritual for as long as anyone can trace, and have not yet been collected and processed by the institutions that produce the official record. They exist. They are simply not yet in the herbarium. Among the plants that have been described in Madagascar in the past 30 years, several are unusual enough to give even a cautious observer a moment's pause. In 2008, a palm tree called Taina spectabilis was formally described for the first time, despite being 18 meters tall and almost impossible to miss. It had simply been growing in a remote part of the northwest of the island, known to the people who lived near it, unknown to everyone else. It flowers once at the end of its life, expending all its energy in a single enormous terminal bloom, then dies. It had been there the entire time. Science had simply not arrived at that particular clearing with a notebook. In 2009, a new species of carnivorous pitcher plant was discovered in the highlands of Borneo, subsequently named Nepenthes raja's even larger cousin, with pitchers large enough to hold 3 liters of digestive fluid and confirmed to have digested rats of substantial size. The researchers who found it noted that it was not, in any meaningful sense, hidden. It grew in an open mountain habitat at a moderate elevation, It had simply not been formally described before, because no one had formally described it, which is different from saying it was not there. Madagascar has its own nepenthes. The genus reaches the edges of the island in a handful of species, small by the standards of the Borneo giants but present, native, functional, operating their pitcher mechanisms in the highland bogs and mossy forests of the interior. The people who live near them have names for them. The names are old. The names are old. The names are older, in several cases, than any European presence on the island, older than any colonial record, older than the letter. The plants have been doing what they do for considerably longer than anyone has been writing it down. There are also the disappearances. This is the part of the accounting that the official position tends not to address directly, not because the official position is evasive, but because disappearances in remote jungle regions are not by themselves evidence of anything specific. People disappear in jungles for many reasons, most of them unglamorous: disease, accident, disorientation, flooding, and the simple directional errors that kill experienced walkers in difficult terrain. The disappearance of an individual explorer or trader in the interior of Madagascar in the 19th century would not have been unusual enough to generate a record. Most of them did not. They were absorbed into the general mortality that the tropics imposed on European visitors, filed under the broad category of died in the field, and mourned, or not mourned, by whoever was waiting for them at home. But there are specific cases. In 1878, 4 years after Lich's letter appeared, and in the period when the legend was circulating most actively, a French naturalist named Edouard Grelier disappeared somewhere in the interior of Madagascar. He had gone in search of specimens of a newly described orchid genus reported by a local trader. He had 2 guides. He left his camp on the 7th day of his expedition and did not return. His guides also did not return. The French colonial administration conducted a brief inquiry. The inquiry produced no findings and was closed. Grelier's notebooks, which he had posted back to Paris in several packages during his expedition, end abruptly in the middle of a description of the forest floor composition in a region he had not named precisely, noting only that it was 3 days' walk northeast of his last fixed point, and that the vegetation was unlike anything he had encountered in his previous 2 expeditions to the island. The last entry is in the middle of a sentence. The sentence does not complete. In 1923, a British plant collector named Howard Saunders Blythe vanished from an expedition operating in the border region between the Central Highlands and the eastern rainforest of Madagascar, an area that was at that time still only partially mapped. He had been working with a local guide whose name the expedition record gives as John Baptiste, and who returned to the base camp on the 5th day without Saunders Blythe, and in a state that his colleagues described, using the particular vocabulary of the period, as much agitated and unwilling to speak of what had passed. Jean-Baptiste did eventually speak, though the record of what he said exists only in a brief note in the expedition journal, written by the expedition's leader, a man named Calvert, who summarized Jean-Baptiste's account in a single sentence before adding that he considered the man's mind to have been disturbed by whatever accident had claimed Saunders Blythe, and that his account should be understood accordingly. The sentence that Calvert wrote, summarizing Jean-Baptiste's explanation for the disappearance of his colleague, reads as follows. He says the ground kept him. The ground kept him. Calvert did not expand on this. He may have understood it as a figure of speech, as a traumatized man's metaphorical attempt to describe a fall into a ravine or a sinkhole or a flooding stream. He may have chosen to expand on it because he did not want to write down what a fuller expansion would have required him to write. The expedition record moves on to logistical matters, to the question of whether the search party had sufficient provisions, and then to the notation that the search was conducted for 3 days and found nothing, and then to the arrangements for returning to the coast. The sentence about the ground stands where it was written and does not explain itself further. The ground kept him. whatever that means. These cases are not proof. They are not even particularly strong evidence of anything other than the routine lethality of jungle exploration. But they are the kind of material that a story like this accumulates around itself the way a nucleus accumulates mass, drawing in adjacent things, incorporating the ambiguous and the unexplained, becoming denser and more substantial, not through the addition of verified fact, but through the addition of unresolved question. The man-eating tree does not need the disappearances to be caused by a man-eating tree in order to make use of them. It only needs the disappearances to have no other explanation that fully satisfies. And this condition is, in the nature of disappearances, reliably met. There are also the unstudied plants. Modern ethnobotanical surveys of Madagascar consistently find, in the oral knowledge of the island's interior communities, descriptions of plants that have not been formally catalogued, not because the people who know them are confused or unreliable, but because formal cataloging requires physical access and institutional resources that have not, in the relevant regions, been consistently available. Among these described but uncatalogued plants, the surveys record, with a frequency that is statistically notable, references to plants with adhesive or trapping properties. Most of these references, clearly describe genuine carnivorous plants of known species. The small and well-documented Nepenthes and Drosera and Utriculataria that are native to the region. But some of the descriptions are more ambiguous. Some describe plants that are larger than any currently catalogued carnivorous species in Madagascar. Some describe adhesive properties of unusual strength. Some include in the traditional cautionary framework around which such knowledge is often organized, the specific warning that these plants should not be approached alone. Do not approach alone. This is practical advice for many things. It is the advice given about terrain that is structurally dangerous, about animals with territorial aggression, about rivers that are faster than they look. It is the advice that communities develop over long contact with specific hazards, advice that encodes in brief, memorable form the accumulated experience of multiple generations with a particular danger. Do not approach alone. The advice does not specify what the danger is. It does not need to. It specifies only what the danger requires: witnesses, the company of others, the assurance that if the ground keeps you, someone will be there to say so. It is worth pausing, before the final accounting, to consider what it means that the warnings persist. Oral traditions are not static things. They are maintained because they continue to serve a function, because the community that carries them finds in them a use, a guidance, a meaning that justifies the effort of transmission, a warning that had no referent, that described a danger that had never manifested in any form that any living member of the community had witnessed or heard, credibly described by someone they trusted, would fade. It would be replaced by more urgent warnings, by more immediately relevant cautions. The fact that warnings about large adhesive plants in Sirte, in areas of the Malagasy interior, are still being recorded by ethnobotanical fieldworkers in the 21st century means that they are still being told, which means that someone is still finding value in telling them. This does not mean the thing warned against is real in the form the legend describes. It may mean only that the landscape in question is genuinely dangerous in ways that the warning encodes imprecisely. It may mean that a smaller, documented carnivorous plant in the region has generated, through long contact, a cautionary tradition that has accumulated mythological weight over generations. It may mean something else entirely, something that has not yet been asked in the right way of the right person in the right place. The field workers who recorded the warnings noted that the people who gave them were not dramatic about it. They were matter-of-fact in the way that people are matter-of-fact about local hazards that have been local hazards for as long as memory runs. They described the plants with the flat, practical tone of someone telling a newcomer not to touch a certain type of mushroom, or not to swim in a certain stretch of river. They did not perform belief. They simply stated, in the way that one states the unremarkable obvious, that there are plants in certain places that should not be approached alone, and then they returned to whatever else they had been talking about, as though the subject required no more emphasis than any other piece of ordinary local knowledge. In 2012, a conservation survey team working in the corridor of remaining forest between the Makira Natural Park and the Masawala Peninsula in the northeast of Madagascar, recorded in their field notes an encounter with a plant they could not immediately identify. The plant was large, substantially larger than the surrounding vegetation would suggest, was typical for the soil and light conditions of that particular understory location. It had a central structure that held standing water, which is not uncommon in certain bromeliads and oriodes, but the water, or the fluid, was unusually viscous and had left a residue on the gloves of the team member who sampled it. The residue proved mildly adhesive. They photographed the plant. They took a sample of the fluid. The photographs are unremarkable by any dramatic standard. A broad-leaved plant in dappled forest light, nothing that would stop a casual viewer. The fluid sample was sent to a laboratory, and the analysis completed several months later and noted in the supplementary materials of a paper on regional forest composition, published in a journal of modest circulation, found that the fluid contained a mixture of compounds including several digestive enzymes associated with carnivorous plant taxa. The paper did not discuss this finding at length. It appeared in the supplementary materials. The plant was not relocated on subsequent visits to the area. The authors noted the finding and moved on. No follow-up study has yet been published. The paper sits in the archive, its supplementary materials unread by most of the people who have cited it, its single anomalous finding waiting, with the patience of data that has not yet been asked the right question, for someone to return. We are, at this point in the accounting, as close as it is possible to get to the heart of the legend, without either affirming or denying it, which is perhaps the only honest position available. No specimen, no verified sighting, no confirmed case. But the botany of the island is incomplete. The record of disappearances is partial. The ethnobotanical memory carries warnings that predate every European account by an unknown number of generations. And somewhere in the highland interior of Madagascar, in a region that is 3 days, walk northeast of a fixed point that no one has relocated, in a forest whose floor composition struck an educated observer as unlike anything he had previously encountered. There is a clearing that no map has named. What grows in that clearing has not been formally described. Whether it has tentacles, whether its central basin holds a clear and slightly sweet and faintly adhesive fluid, whether its leaves are capable of a slow and purposive motion that a careful observer would describe as resembling the closing of a hand. None of these things can be confirmed. None of them can be denied. The door is open by exactly that much, end quote, which is the precise width of the distance between what has been verified and what has been ruled out, and which is, as it happens, exactly the width of a clearing in a forest at the end of a long day's walking, exactly the width that the last light of the afternoon will illuminate before the dark comes in, and the forest, which has been watching you with whatever patience a rooted thing possesses, settles in to wait for morning or for something else. Whichever arrives first, the wind comes first. Before the quiet, before the settling, before the forest finds its nighttime register, the wind moves through the upper canopy in a long, slow wave, the kind of movement that starts somewhere far to the east, over water, over the open ocean where no land interrupts its passage, and travels inland across the coast and through the lower tree line, and up into the highlands, where the tallest trees receive it last and hold it longest, swaying in unison, with a sound that is not quite a sound, more of a presence, a breath drawn and released by something enormously larger than breath, the whole forest inhaling and exhaling together in the blue-dark hour between sunset and full night. If you have ever stood in such a forest at such an hour, you know the feeling. If you have not, it is the feeling. of being very small in the right way, the way that is not frightening but releasing, the way that reminds you that the world was here before you and will be here after and is proceeding in its slow vegetable way, with or without your participation, and that this is not a threat but a relief. The clearing in the story is empty now. The story has been told. Carl Lich has sent his letter, and the letter has been read and reprinted, and translated, and reprinted again, and the newspapers have run their illustrations, and the scientists have held their debates, and the legend has made its long journey around the world and back, and the clearing itself, the specific physical clearing in the northeast highlands of Madagascar, where all of this may or may not have begun, is exactly as it has always been, which is to say, it is a clearing in a forest, lit at this hour by the particular quality of light that falls through canopy gaps just after sunset, a light that is neither day nor dark but something in between, something that the photographers call blue hour and the poets have called by a dozen names in a dozen languages, all of them reaching for the same quality of suspension, of the world holding its breath before the night fully arrives. The trees are still. This is the first thing to say about them, and the truest, and in the context of everything that has been said about them over the past 150 years, the most important. They are still. The leaves that the story described as reaching, as curving inward, as capable of a slow and purposive closing motion, are not moving. They are simply leaves, broad and dark in the fading light, catching the last of the day's warmth on their upper surfaces and releasing it slowly into the cooling air, the way all leaves do, the way they have always done, the way they will do tomorrow and the day after and for as long as the rains come and the light comes and the roots hold in the red soil of the highland forest. This is what leaves are for. This is what they do. It is a quiet and unhurried process, and it requires nothing from you. And it is happening everywhere around you right now, in every forest on every continent, in the window boxes of city apartments, and in the potted plants on office desks, and in the long grass at the edges of roads, the silent metabolic work of the green world, going about its endless, patient business of turning light into life. Something releases when you understand this, something that has been held at a slight tension, not quite fear, not quite alertness, but the physiological state that is the low background hum of having been told a story about something in the dark. That thing releases its grip on the muscles of the shoulders and the back of the neck. That thing releases its grip on the muscles of the shoulders and the back of the neck, and the breathing deepens by a fraction, and the heart settles into its slower evening rhythm. And you remember, because the body remembers these things, even when the mind is still occupied with images of tentacles and sweet adhesive fluid, that you are lying down, that you are warm, that the darkness around you is the familiar darkness of a room you know, not the darkness of a forest at the edge of a map. The night sounds of the real forest are nothing like the silence of horror stories. Horror requires quiet. Real forests at night are full of sound, full of the patient, unremarkable industry of creatures going about their nocturnal lives without reference to human fear or human legend. In the forests of Madagascar, the night belongs to the lemurs, who move through the upper canopy with a speed and assurance that suggests they have never once in their evolutionary history been troubled by the idea of a man-eating tree below them, that the tree, if it ever existed in any form, was never their concern because they were always above it, always in the branches, always in the moving air, above the stillness of the forest floor. Their calls are part of the night's texture now, low and resonant and carrying across distances that seem too large for sound to travel. But sound travels far in a forest at night because the air is still and the bark of the trees conducts it, and there is nothing to absorb it except the moss on the ground, and the moss is patient and soft and takes things gently. Further away, deeper in, a stream is moving. You cannot see it from here, but you can hear it if you are quiet enough. A sound that is lower and more constant than the lemur calls. A sound that has been continuous since the last rain and will be continuous until the dry season comes. The sound of water finding its level, of the hill giving up its moisture in the most gradual and inevitable way, water moving over stones that the water itself has shaped over centuries of the same passage, each stone slightly smoother than it was the previous year, slightly more perfectly fitted to the flow, the whole arrangement tending over geological time toward a frictionlessness that it will never entirely achieve, but will approach forever, getting closer and closer to perfect smoothness without ever arriving, which is perhaps the most soothing thing in the world to contemplate. The infinite approach toward peace, above the canopy, the infinite approach toward peace. Above the canopy, which you cannot see from the floor but which you can imagine with precision because the canopy is one of those things that the imagination renders easily and completely, something about the scale of it matching some interior template that was already there. Above the canopy the stars are appearing. Not all at once, one at a time, the way they always appear, the brightest first, and then the others coming in behind, filling in from the most obvious to the most subtle, the sky darkening around them as they emerge until the full population of the night sky is present. More stars than any light-polluted city allows you to see, the kind of sky that people who grew up with it take for granted and people who grew up without it find briefly overwhelming. The Milky Way visible as a structural feature of the sky, rather than a rumor, the great arm of the galaxy laid across the dark in a band that has no sharp edges, that fades from bright at the center to invisible at the margins, grading through every intermediate luminosity, in a way that repays long looking, that yields more the longer you stay with it, more texture, more variation, more depth than the first glance suggested. The Southern Cross is visible from the highlands of Madagascar, low on the southern horizon, tilted slightly from the orientation that navigators use to find true south, a constellation that the peoples of the southern hemisphere have incorporated into their stories and their wayfinding for as long as there have been peoples of the southern hemisphere, which is a very long time, longer than the legend of the man-eating tree, longer than the newspapers that reprinted Carl Lich's letter, longer than the European presence on the island, longer than most of the things that the century of the legend considered old. The Southern Cross is not concerned with the legend. The Southern Cross is engaged in the slow rotation that carries it across the sky from east to west over the course of the night, a rotation that is of course the rotation of the earth, and not of the cross, but the body perceives it as the cross moving, as the sky turning, as the world slowly and with enormous dignity pivoting around you while you remain still at the center, which is a feeling that the night sky has always been capable of producing in a human being, lying on their back looking up, the feeling of being simultaneously very small and very central, a paradox that the night resolves, not by answering it, but by making it feel irrelevant. The forest floor is soft. This is something that the stories about forests tend not to mention, because softness is not dramatic, but it is true, and it is worth saying. The floor of an old forest is one of the softest surfaces in the natural world. Decades of fallen leaves, compressed and composted and compressed again, create a layer of organic material that is inches deep and gives beneath weight like something between moss and mattress, something that receives and supports and does not resist. The roots of the large trees make ridges and hollows in this surface, and the hollows fill with the deepest accumulation of leaf matter. And in the hollows the ground is softest, and in those softest places small things have made their homes, beetles and millipedes, and the tiny frogs that the forest holds in improbable abundance, each of them going about their night's work in perfect indifference to the large world of legend and narrative that exists above them at the scale of human storytelling. A moth moves through the clearing. It is large, as the moths of Madagascar tend to be, its wingspan spanning the width of a spread hand, its wings the color of bark and shadow, the perfect non-color that renders it invisible against any surface it chooses to rest on. It does not rest, it moves through the clearing in the elliptical, unhurried pattern of a creature navigating by the stars, which some moths do, which is something that the Victorian naturalists knew, and that we have since confirmed with more precision, that certain nocturnal insects orient themselves by celestial bodies, that they carry in their small nervous systems a navigational apparatus that uses the same fixed points that the human sailors used, the same stars, same patient permanent lights. The moth completes its ellipse and moves into the tree line on the other side, and is immediately invisible, and the clearing is empty again, and the sound of the stream continues, and the stars continue their rotation, and the leaves of the trees are still. There is a frog somewhere close, on a leaf at knee-height in the undergrowth, calling in the short rhythmic pulse that is either territorial claim or courtship, neither of which requires anything from you, both of which are simply the sound of a small creature engaged in the endless enterprise of continuing its lineage in a world that is mostly indifferent to whether it succeeds. The frog has no opinion about the man-eating tree. The frog has no opinion about Carl Lich, or the question of what grows in the unstudied clearings of the northeast highlands. The frog is calling from its leaf in the dark, and the call is going out into the night air, and the night air is receiving it, with complete equanimity, passing it along through the trees, and over the stream and up through the canopy gaps into the star-filled sky above, dispersing it into the general texture of the forest's sound, where it joins the other calls, and the other sounds and the stream, and the wind in the upper branches, and becomes part of the single continuous voice of a living system, going about its living, which is the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world, depending on how long you listen to it, and how still you are when you listen. There is a particular quality to the air in the hour after the first full dark settles into a forest. It cools first, and the cools brings out the sense that the heat of the day suppressed, the damper smell, and the green smell of the living plants releasing their daytime gases, and underlying both of these a smell that is older and harder to name, the smell of things decomposing slowly and completely in the dark, the smell of last year's leaves becoming this year's soil, the smell of the long patient process by which everything that was alive becomes in time the ground that new things grow in. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of continuity, of the forest's long memory, of a system that wastes nothing and loses nothing and converts everything it receives into something the next generation of living things can use. It is the smell of a process so much larger and older and more encompassing than any single creature within it, that breathing it in produces something close to comfort, close to the feeling of being held by something that does not need you to do anything, that will proceed with its work regardless, that has no expectations and no disappointments, and no story to tell except the one it has always been telling, which is the story of growth and change and the patient return of all things to the soil and the air and the water and the light. The legend of the man-eating tree was born in this forest, or in a forest very like it, and the forest has outlasted the legend by a long margin, and will outlast it by a longer one still. Lich's letter has been reprinted and debated and finally filed under the taxonomy of human imagination, under the heading of things we needed to believe in order to say something true about ourselves and our fears and our relationship to the unmapped world. The tree that the letter described does not appear in any herbarium. The Kodo do not appear in any reliable anthropological record. The clearing has no coordinates that anyone has successfully verified, and yet the forest is here, and it is real, and it is enormous, and it is going about its work with the same indifference to human categories that it has always maintained, making no distinction between the parts of itself that have been catalogued and the parts that have not, between the species that have been formally named and the species that are still waiting for a scientist to arrive with a notebook and a specimen jar, and the institutional affiliation that makes a discovery official, whatever is in those uncatalogued parts, is not hungry tonight. Or if it is hungry in the way that all living things are hungry, which is to say continuously, and without drama, the background condition of being alive, the steady metabolic requirement that drives the engine of every organism from the smallest bacterium to the largest tree, the need for energy and nitrogen, and the particular molecular configurations that allow growth to continue. This is hunger without malice. This is hunger without intention. This is hunger as a fact of chemistry, as ordinary and as neutral as the rotation of the Southern Cross or the movement of water over stones or the slow composting of last year's leaves into this year's soil. It is nothing to be afraid of. It is simply the world, doing what the world does, in the dark, in the forest, in the soft highland air of an island in the Indian Ocean, where the stars are out and the lemurs are calling, and a moth is navigating by the same fixed lights that the sailors used, and the trees are still, and the clearing is empty, and the story has been told, and the telling has come to its end, and the end is this: the sound of water, steady and distant, and moving in the direction that water always moves, downhill, toward the coast, toward the open sea, toward the coast, toward the open sea, toward the long dark horizon, where the night sky meets the ocean, and both of them go on, and on, and on, in the direction of a morning that is already forming somewhere to the east, somewhere out over the water. Light beginning to accumulate in the way that light accumulates, quietly and without announcement, simply becoming more present degree by degree, until the darkness is no longer quite what it was, until the shapes of things begin to return to themselves, until the forest, which has been here all night, doing what forests do, which is everything and nothing, and the slow, impossible work of turning time into life, receives the first suggestion of the coming day, and the moths return to their bark-colored rest, and the lemurs settle into their high branches, and the stream continues its passage over its smooth stones, and the leaves of the trees are still, and the clearing is empty and quiet and ordinary and safe, and you are here, and you are warm, and whatever the forest contains tonight, it is not reaching for you. And the stars above the canopy are the same stars they have always been, fixed and patient and impossibly far away, and everything is still and everything is well.